Hello and welcome. I am here live with my friend TJ Martinell of tjmartinell.com. He is an author, an amateur historian, and like myself, an armchair general. In this episode, we are going to be talking about the Siege of Alesia. Now, this was a battle that TJ picked, but it's one I know quite a bit about. It was a battle that occurred in the middle of the Gallic Wars when Caesar went into Gaul, what is modern day France, and decided to kill all the Celts. My people, by the way. And I always we're going to talk about the siege. We're going to have to talk a little bit about the setup to it. There was kind of a lot going into this. It was kind of famous. Unfortunately, most of what we know about this battle, or 99% of what we know about this battle, was written by Julius Caesar himself. And he wasn't the most, when he wrote the Gallic Wars, he literally wrote about himself in the third person. Like he would say, and then Caesar charged into the troops on his horse and rallied them. I'm not kidding. You can read it.
I've read the book. Dan Carlin brilliantly described it as it would be as if the Star Wars saga was written by Darth Vader.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. Oh, yeah, and hi, English James, and thank you for the comment about me. Yes, I am a fat Mick, I suppose, but I think you spelled Mick. I think you spelled Mick wrong as the Irish, but anyway, that's okay. So anyway, we got to talk now. Let me ask a question. So I approached TJ just 2 days ago with this idea, and he said, "Yeah, if the schedule allows, this could be something interesting." We are both, historians. We both read a lot about history, and we both really enjoy it. And I listed a couple of different battles. Not this one. This one was totally TJ's idea, and I jumped for it because I was like, "Yeah, that's another great battle." But I'm going to ask TJ. I haven't asked him this yet. Why this battle, TJ, for this debut? Hopefully, there'll be more of these. All hopefully, we're going to do this bi-weekly, but we'll see.
I was given a book for Christmas a couple years ago called "Great Battles: Decisive Conflicts That Have Shaped History." And most of the battles I had heard of, Verdun, Marathon, the Gettysburg, Antietam, I had never heard of Alesia. And I had read some, there had been mentions of Caesar's campaigns in Gaul regarding brief overviews. None of them had ever mentioned this. And what makes it such a remarkable battle is that it's almost unique in any battle military history that I've ever read, where it was Caesar, the attacker was besieging the city while being besieged behind.
Yes.
And not in a where they were fighting off a relief force, because that happened in other battles. Obviously, relief forces come to attack, like you saw at the siege of Vienna. This was an example where Caesar's men built fortifications on both sides. So he basically built his own fort around a city, but also to protect himself from being attacked. And he was able to do that with 45,000 men. He was besieging a city of 70,000, and the relief force was believed to be around 250,000 men.
Can we stop there? Okay. The numbers are exaggerated a little bit, we think.
Right.
Especially the numbers of the relief force. They pretty much said there's no way that the relief force was 250,000 men.
I'd have to agree. I mean, the logistics involved with 250,000 men, getting the water, food, provisions, and moving them in a migration. That's like the migration of the Helvetii, which preceded this siege. I think what we can say is there was more men in the town than Caesar had besieging it, and there was a larger relief force than the number Caesar had. So, for the sake of just being on the conservative side, both sides were larger than Caesar's. He was fighting two larger armies on both sides. I think might be a possible.
Yes. Yes, he was. I'm trying to bring up a good picture of the map of the fortifications that he built. But basically, do you want to describe it? So basically, what happened? Well, we should probably set it up, right? The way what happened was, from my understanding, and TJ will correct me where I'm wrong, is this was a couple years into Caesar's campaign. This battle happened in 52 BC. Caesar had already been in Gaul for at least 2 years, I believe.
Yeah,
and
he had been in Gaul for a couple of years.
And his strategy was to kind of play the tribes off each other. See, the thing about the Celts were, like most of the Indo-European tribes, like the Germans that later followed them, was they consisted of individual tribes, each kind of being ruled by a local chieftain. And they often fought amongst themselves. And so the Romans, what they did was they defeated some tribes. Like they'd find out like which tribe was enemies with these other tribes. They would buddy up to them, and then with Roman help, they would, they would get together and they'd gang up on them, and then Rome would subjugate Caesar would subjugate all of them, pay off the nobles to keep them in line, that kind of thing. Now there was a man named, you want to tell everybody who he was? His name began with a V.
Oh, Vercingetorix.
Vercingetorix, yes.
Yeah.
Now he belonged to a Celtic tribe called the Avini, I believe it is.
I'm looking that up right now. I believe so, yes.
And he ended up, now there was a lot of Celts that were not happy with this Roman incursion into their territories. So much so that they were able to kind of put aside their differences and pretty much allow him to become in charge of all the tribes. Not all I mean, some of them stayed loyal to Rome, some of them stayed out of it, but a great number of them did join Vercingetorix. And he was apparently a pretty skilled commander. He liked to fight the Romans, not in pitched battles. He liked to harass them. He also was, I believe, I could be wrong here, but I believe he was the first general ever to practice the scorched earth policy in recorded history.
Yeah. So two things about it. Yes, he did the scorched earth. He also was engaging for a very long time in the Fabian strategy because, like with the Romans when Hannibal invaded, Vercingetorix didn't really have to win the war. They just had to not lose. They didn't have. They had to avoid being defeated in a campaign. But he had two problems. One is his army was loose confederation. It was like John was saying. It was these were not tribes that were consolidated prior. They were their loyalties were very local. It was to a local chief and not to any kind of larger political body. So what he would do for a long time is he would engage in these hit and runs for the most part, and trying to threaten Caesar's supply lines, because like with many invading armies, he had a long supply line that he needed to get resources in to Gaul. And had those ever been threatened or attacked, Caesar would have been in big trouble. He would have probably been forced to withdraw from Gaul, period, or his army would have just been surrounded and destroyed. So that's where Vercingetorix was also, as we'll later discuss, he was very much committed to all or nothing. When it came down to it, he was either we're going to win or we're going to die as a people. We're not going to be subject to slavery, or at least in his mind, we're not going to be subject to slavery. We're not going to lose. He was total commitment for that.
Well, he also knew that even if how do I say this? A draw would still mean his head on a spike, because Caesar would have paid somebody off to just deliver his body. Here's 100 talents of gold or something.
I think that this goes to show one of the logistical things was the political strategy. Vercingetorix had to combine loose confederations of tribes that were warring with each other. Caesar was able to gain Gallic allies that had been civilized according to Roman, customs and civilization. he was also able to enlist mercenaries.
German mercenaries, that's
German
correct.
mercenaries. And so this is where he was able to keep a lot of alliances and a lot of different groups together. And he definitely knew how to play tribes off of one another or to maintain loyalties for the most part. But like John was saying, these loyalties were not very deep. They were, for most instances, they were. It wasn't like with Spain when Hannibal invaded Italy, or when he was invading, the Roman Empire. He decisively beat the Romans in these very devastating battles like Cannae, but expecting that their colonies would abandon them. But Spain did not abandon Rome after the Battle of Cannae. So their loyalty to Rome was much greater than the loyalty of these Gallic tribes were to Caesar, because when he ended up losing one significant battle, many of them deserted and went to Vercingetorix's side.
Right. So many went to fight along their Celtic cousins, or they just stayed out of it. A lot of these, and the same with the mercenaries, they're only as loyal as they keep getting paid.
Right.
Which I'm assuming back in those days just meant gold or slaves.
Yep, definitely.
And I don't know if the mercenaries had much use for slaves, because most of them didn't own any land slaves would be more trouble than they're worth.
Well, here was actually an issue I was trying to research for this. I was compiling some basic notes. I don't remember if this was before or after the Roman army opened up its enlistment to men who didn't own property, because at one point in the Roman army, you could not be a member, you could not be a soldier unless you owned property. You had to be a property owner. And at some point,
yes, that was opened up. That's interesting point. That was true. You had to be a Roman citizen who owned property. And actually the reason they loosened that restriction was because of Hannibal. It was under Hannibal's campaign that they opened up the enlistment ranks,
because they were the property owners were dead.
Well, they were running low on manpower. Also, a lot of property owners ended up being forced to sell their property when they were away at war, because they couldn't maintain them and pay the taxes. So that's how I can't remember the name of the guy that became super rich. He was like the richest man in Rome. The one that
Marcus Crassus.
Crassus. He was the guy that put down Spartacus, correct?
Yes. He also he died at some point. He was fighting in the Persian area, or somewhere around there. But he was the richest man in the Rome. I was just reading Cicero's On Duties, his book on that, to his son, and he was talking about Crassus wealth.
Yes, Crassus was the wealthy, and basically he would that's kind of how he became rich, was through land, as some things never changed, TJ.
Yeah. Well, land, I mean, this is an interesting, and the reason I was going to bring that up is because I was trying to determine to what extent that affected the Roman army's functioning, because when your rank file soldier owns property and they're citizen soldiers, they have a different attitude than a commoner whose only way of gaining wealth or becoming established is through their commander. Their loyalties are different. The property owning citizen soldiers' loyalty was to the Republic, but under Caesar's army, his army was going to be loyal to him.
Correct.
Because that's the only way that they were going to gain their wealth, was through conquest. And imagine if you were some poor guy, you go join the Roman army, you go fight in Gaul, and you come back with a whole bunch of slaves.
Mm-hmm.
That you can and if you can't have them work on fields because you don't own land, you can sell them. You could go sell them in Rome, or sell them somewhere else, and you'd pocket the money. I mean, either way, that they were going to be worth money to the person selling it. But that's the reason I was interested in finding out whether they own property, if the Roman soldiers own property, because if they were all property owners, that might have changed the dynamic between how they viewed slaves as wealth, but also their motivation to fight.
Yes, I mean they did. It's kind of interesting on both sides, the different motivations they have to fight and what that truly means to an army. And we'll touch on how that was important in a moment when we get into the details of the siege itself. But so I do want to media hits. John, get off my lawn, Steel. Hey, get off my lawn. Yeah, that actually takes new precedence during this current time period we're in. So anyway, so basically, shall we say, Vercingetorix, after he started to unify the different Celtic tribes, he kind of fought a harassing campaign against Julius Caesar. That was quite effective.
It was. And what ended up happening is Caesar started attacking specific towns and cities, and he actually went after Vercingetorix's, I believe it was his hometown, the capital. Sorry, it was the capital of the Arvini at George. I don't know how to pronounce some of these words in the Gaelic, but Gergovia. I think that's how you pronounce it, Gergovia. And it was,
and I think that was, and I believe that town was not. He didn't raise that town for whatever reason, and it came.
He got defeated there. So he had initial success. So this is important for what led up to Alesia. Is he attacked it, and it's not clear what happened, but his troops overextended their initial success, so they directly attacked the city and the town walls, and they suffered significant casualties, and it was so bad Caesar had to withdraw. And this is actually what caused a lot of Caesar's allies to leave. And Vercingetorix then was thought, we can actually engage them in battle if we force them to besiege a town. So that's what led up to Alesia. Is Vercingetorix brought his troops back to Alesia, which was this fortress city on a hill.
Well, from what I understand, though, wasn't planning on wintering there. He expected Caesar to return to Italy for winter and then come back in the spring. I could be wrong on this one.
He was probably a combination of both. He was withdrawing and thinking, if I'm going to get attacked, I'm in a defensible position. We can replicate the same success. It may have also been for the winter, but this was a town that was intended to be well defended. There was no way to. There was really no way to attack the town.
It was the epitome of the high ground, shall we say?
It was the epitome of the high ground. It would have not been practical for Caesar to try and take it, which is why when Caesar came up, he decided to instead build a fortification. And this is where we turn to the topic of the Roman centurion as being a combination of a soldier and a construction worker.
Yes, an engineer. Well, let's. I'm going to have you describe this. I'll just give my brief description. So, picture the town on a hill, of like a fortified city on a hill, and at the bottom of the hill. Now, you want to describe the two concentric circles and how this was quite brilliant, and I believe it was Caesar's idea himself, though it's lost to history if it was what he did.
I don't really know how to describe it other than to say he had all of his entire wall and fortifications were up a slight slope, and you had ditches in front of it. You had all this different stuff that was intended to slow down troops trying to attack so that they could be killed by aerial objects of some kind. And he had towers stationed every, I'd say, 20 feet.
Yeah, lookout towers. Yeah,
lookout towers. And so I'm just looking in more of this. So he constructed a 20-foot ditch with perpendicular sides to prevent them from interfering with his construction. I'm reading from the book right now. And then he kept building more and more and more. And when he finished it, it was like 10 miles long. Like, this is what's crazy is how long it was. It was 10 miles. And then eventually it became 17. So he built a 17-mile long wall around this city.
Well, actually, two walls.
Yeah, he built it on both sides. Yeah. He built an incredibly long wall around this city, and he had his. I mean, think of the logistics of having your troops move around in that, like trying to move troops inside a very narrow corridor, whereas the Celts didn't have that problem. They could attack any point in dispersed.
It's kind of like the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Like there was, just think about trying to communicate. Like if you're building a wall around a mountain, how can you tell like the progress on the guys 17, not 17 or half of 17, directly opposed to you on the other side of the mountain? You can't see them, right? So you'd have to have a guy on the horse, traveling, 8.5 miles to tell the guy on the other side, how the progress is going there. And so they had to chop down all the forest around there to get the wood to build all this stuff. And they had to do it on the spot. They didn't have these supplies with them.
Right.
And they were in, shall we say, hostile territory, right? So all of this building and construction went on under fire.
Yeah, they were being constantly attacked by Vercingetorix's men. And I'm trying to think, Dan Carlin was talking about how when they sent out the cavalry to go get reinforcements, I can't remember if he was saying that was a critical error on Caesar's part, or if that was a critical, you know what it was? He was making the argument that instead of fleeing to warn the other tribes, they should have attacked Caesar's men. I think that was the argument he was making, that if they had attacked instead of fled to spread the news, they could have actually stopped construction.
Perhaps. No one's quite certain with that, because I have heard that argument. And so during the construction of this wall until like the end of it, I don't know how long the siege lasted, by the way. You may have that handy. But it actually took quite some time to totally build these fortifications. So basically the wall closest to the mountain, if you want to call it that, was built on the base of the hill or the small mountain. That wall was basically built in an attempt to keep Vercingetorix and his troops inside, while the outer wall was built to prevent a relief force from coming in. So the Romans were basically, we're basically in the middle, so to speak, between the two walls. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but that was kind of the strategy there.
Right. And what's amazing is that they were able to build. The Romans could build these structures in a very short time period. They could build. What they would do when they were traveling is they would have wagons, and then they would take them apart, build the fort, spend the night, wake up, take it apart, turn it back into a wagon, and then keep moving. So they had this very. This is actually where the concept of the bureaucracy developed, was with the Roman army, because there were so many logistics involved that they had to have people tracking all the different resources that they needed, and that proved to be, they were masters of ancient world engineering that really proved itself here during this battle. But this is where I think some of the weaknesses for the Celts, the lack of coordination, was probably where it became problematic for them, because I don't think that they quite had a solid battle strategy when they came. I just don't understand. Maybe I'm not visualizing it, or I wasn't there, obviously, because I'll never know. But if you had that many men, what they couldn't do, I guess, let me back up. They couldn't coordinate with Vercingetorix. They could not coordinate with him and have them all attack the same section of the wall at the same time, breach the perimeter, and then at the very least they could get reinforcements into the town before the Romans could close off the breach and return. You sneak men in or something. It
would be more. I think it would be, at that point, it would be more important to get men out. Because
that is true. That's an important, and here's the curious thing is, all you had to do, because of the way that the wall restricted troop movement, you only needed a small force to open up a hole or a small section of a breach, and then just have everybody go out while you cover the vulnerable points. I mean, that would be one kind of battle plan, because I was writing down different things that the Celts could have done differently in this instance, and that may have been one of them. Is they just you're not trying to win directly; you're just trying to salvage the people in that town.
Yes, correct. And another thing that is important to note was inside the town were lots of women and children.
Yeah.
And another handicap the Celts had were many of their warriors were not professional soldiers. Now, the Celts did have kind of almost like a warrior caste.
Yeah.
But many of the people, like on this, think of the Spartans, like they did have the equals, as they called them, and then there was the Paraquoi, the tradesmen, and then there was the Helots, the slaves, or not slaves, but you know what I mean. And but when a war came, everybody had to take up the sword and shield, and that was basically what happened with the Celts. A lot of them were farmers, but now it's time to fight. So pick up your shield and let's go. So unlike the Roman soldiers that had been fighting for 2 years, they were battle hardened.
Right. I think that's the difference between them and the Spartans. But again, the Spartans were they had a unified training regimen. They all, because they relied on, like most Greeks, the phalanx, their tight formation. In fact, that was from what I've been reading, the most ancient world combat was really based around that. It was not based around these, you watch these movies where there's this hand-to-hand, one-on-one, mano-a-mano type of fighting. That really didn't happen. What would happen is whoever could coordinate the best and maintain a cohesive unit the most for the longest amount of time would end up winning the battle, because there's so much chaos that would involve if every guy was just fighting by himself or something like that. So what the Spartans would do is that they'd all been trained, so they all knew what to do. Whereas the Gauls, the Celts were very, I'd say, individualistic. It was based on personal bravery, heroism, that kind of thing. And they had all learned how to probably train differently than what the guys in the next tribe had done. So their strategies weren't as unified as the Spartans were. Their strategy wasn't as unified as the Romans were. So I think that was, and maybe they just weren't used to dealing with the Roman fortifications when they went to attack. I mean, they had to have siegecraft, and
right. They had no sense. From what I understand, the Celts had zero sense of siegecraft.
Yeah, they were very much just that beginning part of the movie Gladiator, where it shows the Germans just bravely, defiantly challenging the Romans, I think is probably more accurate than was really intended. I don't think that they were trying to make it a very accurate. Who knows? I'm not sure what battle they'd be referencing, but that definitely displayed the Celtic Germanic attitude. Was bravery was more important than pragmatism. I think that's one of the struggles that people like Vercingetorix dealt with. Is pragmatism means knowing to withdraw rather than fight. And he was the type of guy who knew when not to fight a battle. And except this was one of the ones where he got entangled more. You were mentioning about the women and children, and that's actually got to the point where they had a council of war, and they were running out of food. And they said, you know what? The women and children need to go leave the city. And they basically put them out in the middle of no man's land for a while. And then it became too much. And so they eventually brought them back into the city. But that was kind of what I was saying earlier in this live stream about how Vercingetorix and those others were willing to go all the way. That's an extreme I don't know I've ever read or seen in any other example of a battle, which I think shows how determined they were to win and what they thought they were going to lose if they were defeated, which is kind of exactly what happened in a lot of ways.
Can someone tell me, can anyone see the screen share I'm doing now?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay. So this is a picture of Alesia. You can see it's there, and it shows this was at the end of the battle, shall we say? And the red is the Gauls, and the blue is the Romans and their allies. And you can see what happens is that the red arrow is going away from on the outside on the perimeter here. That is after the relief force came, failed to breach the outer wall. At the same time, what happened was when the relief force came, and there was really no way to communicate. This wasn't like radios or anything, right? They just the Vercingetorix knew they were coming. He didn't know when, but when they got there and they showed up, he saw them coming, and he simultaneously ordered his men down. And so, apparently, the lines almost broke. That they almost did it, but they couldn't properly coordinate attack. So eventually, the relief force just gave up, and Vercingetorix had to go back and retreat. But by this time, guess what? Guess what was going on inside Alesia? TJ, did I lose you?
Sorry,
TJ.
I had on mute. I try not to have everyone hear when the train comes by.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, but yeah. So what was happening? So what happened was, they were running out of food.
Yeah, they were running out of food,
and by this, so the relief force had fled. They were running out of food, and rumor is they actually reverted to cannibalism.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so at this point, Caesar just literally waited them out.
Yeah.
And they were, they had no way to resupply at this point. I think he had used up his cavalry in the attack when he was trying to coordinate with the relief force that came and attacked the outer wall. And there was no way to resupply. Now, he probably could have got out himself personally.
But he chose not to.
But he chose not to. And apparently he came down. Keep talking more about the battle as you understand it. And what I left out.
What happened is there was one part where the Roman ranks were actually going to break. And Caesar put on his red cape, his red robe, so that no one could mistake him for who he was. And then he led 4 cohorts to go seal up the breach. And it was a struggle. What happened is then the German cavalry arrived and completely just ran down the remaining Celts, and then the rest of them fled. So that's really what ended it in that case, is when the German, I'm not necessarily, it's hard. I don't think we'll ever know whether they played the decisive role in that battle and what would have happened if Caesar had ended up having to withdraw, because it's kind of hard. All of his stuff is there. Like, you can't, I think for Caesar, this is what I really find interesting, is for both sides, it was do or die. Because I don't think the Romans could have, what were they going to do? Their wagons had probably been converted into structures, into fortifications. So they
were also extremely low on food too, from what I understand.
Well, yes, the Romans were also. So what happened is the women and children actually went over to the Roman side when they were kicked out of the city, and they offered to sell themselves as labor if they were fed. And Caesar said no, but his reason was because his men didn't have any food. Like,
right, there was no way to feed them, and
we can't feed you. So I think they remained in no man's land, and I think that's why it just got to the men. And it's bad for morale when the people that you're fighting for are between you and the enemy. So that's why they ended up coming back in. But this is a very unique situation in the sense that Vercingetorix really didn't have any bargaining power at that point, because his relief army probably was not, like, they were not going to carry on the fight without him. He was like one of those men who probably grasped the fact that if he quit, it was over. The moment he decided it was over, it was for him. It was over for everyone else. No one else was gonna push this for him. And so that must have been a pretty difficult thing for him to go, surrender to Caesar, because there were Romans during the Civil War that did not. I think it was Cato the Younger who committed suicide rather than accept surrender from, rather than accept Caesar's rule. He ended up killing himself.
Right. Well, I believe there was, I think I saw this in a movie where one of the reasons that the Celts surrendered was, and I don't know if there was any truth to this at all, or it's just a literary tool, but was that they didn't want their gods to die, and if they died, their gods would die with them.
That's probably where this is. I was watching a documentary on this, and Caesar did not engage in any more other than Vercingetorix, and he obviously sold some of the men into slavery. They were given to his soldiers as booty, and then old term sense, not modern term, loot or plunder. And then he ended up having Vercingetorix strangled in Rome. But other than that,
well, 6 years later, yeah.
Well, now why you would wait 6 years to do that, I don't know. I'm not sure why you would not just and this was Caesar. This was a man who was very famous for giving pardons or clemency or forgiving his enemies. That's why Cato the Younger, he knew Caesar was going to pardon him for opposing him in the Civil War. He still killed himself, and Caesar felt jilt. he felt cheated. He said, "I got cheated out of my chance to give him clemency." When he was told that Cato the Younger killed himself, he said he did that just to spite me, because he knew I was gonna forgive him. But I'm surprised he didn't do that with Vercingetorix. But the point I was getting at is that he didn't engage in any more mass killings or attacks. Once Gaul was defeated, he had the main reason, if for no other reason, you have to leave some people behind to actually rule. You can't kill everyone. Dan Carlin titled his podcast on this, the Celtic Holocaust. I think the difference between this and other similar levels of killing, because Caesar killed over 1 million Celts in this I mean, over 1 million Celts died as a part of this campaign. I didn't even know that until I was reading or listening to Carlin's podcast on this. I think the difference was Caesar's was more of a conquest of submission. He was trying to subdue the territory. Yes. He was not trying to. You don't wipe out people that you think can actually prove of use. It was like the Gallic tribes that they'd already civilized. They were looking to do the same with these other tribes and control them, but they didn't want them all gone.
Well, also, yes, I mean you need people to work the fields, right?
Exactly.
So you can't, if they went and they killed everybody to the last child. I mean, they weren't orcs, it wasn't like, what was that? The second episode of the Lord of the Rings, they weren't looking to exterminate them per se. I think in this case, though, because Vercingetorix had been such a pain in Caesar's ass, he wanted him dead just because, you know what I mean? Like, you son of a bitch, you killed, how many of my men, and you made me look really bad. And the whole invasion of Gaul that had been going on for 2 years was put in jeopardy by Vercingetorix.
Right. And he had made it, he had turned what should have been a pretty easy ordeal into this long-term campaign of where Caesar found himself fighting for his life.
Right. And literally his life, in the sense, not so much he would be died at the hands of the Gauls, but you got to understand the cutthroat politics that went on in Rome.
Yeah.
Especially during that time, because this is on the cusp of the Republic and the Empire. And although Rome was kind of always on that cusp, wasn't it?
It's funny. I was reading the book Cicero's on Duties, and the translator Quintus Curtius said one of the problems with Cicero is he failed to recognize that the Republic was already dead in spirit before it was in name. So he was trying to preserve a republic that didn't exist anymore in any meaningful sense. So by the time of Caesar's campaign in Gaul, the republic was, as it was traditionally understood, was gone. What you had was a completely different animal. And you were mentioning, Caesar, the cutthroat politics. Yes, but what the irony is that Caesar's success in Gaul only frightened his own colleagues. I mean, the triumvirate with
triumvirate, yeah,
triumvirate. I never pronounced that right. It's like Rubicon. I never pronounced that right. They freaked out and they ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome. And instead, he marched across the river with his army. And so,
we're going to get to that. Like, Julius Caesar is why the expression "crossing the Rubicon" has entered modern parlance,
right?
Because it was the tradition. The Rubicon is a river in Italy, and the tradition had always been when a general returns back to Rome before he comes back, when he reaches the river, the river Rubicon, he disbands the army, and that was just the way it was. You don't march your army on Rome. You're a Roman,
right?
And Caesar. Caesar being Caesar, from what I understand, though, he did disband his army except for the 13th Legion, from what I understand.
Well, also the principle was a Roman army was never to be inside Rome itself.
Right. They didn't have a standing army in Rome per se. It was kind of the
yeah, and so that was where things got really. Rome's similarities, this is a side thing, but Rome's similarities to the American Republic and its history are very similar in, I'd say, external senses, but that's one of the examples is, they didn't really have the standing army in that area. But yeah, you were talking about the cutthroat politics of Rome at the time. There was this is where you may not kill your opponents or your enemies, but this is another example where Cicero was just completely out of his league. He was trying to play a game that he just was not good at. Caesar was one of the guys who could play this game. He knew how to behave. He knew what to say. He knew who to make friends with, who to make alliances with. He could strategize on the battlefield and politics. Whereas other guys, if you lose, you end up dead. Your enemies can kill you. And they can do it in ways that are different. They're not just going to go up and kill you. They can poison you. You can be sent off to go fight in a war that you're probably going to die in or something like that. Did you ever see the movie Spartacus? That it goes into some of the
which one?
The one with Kirk Douglas.
Oh yeah. I got a kick out of that one because they had the Roman soldiers wearing wristwatches.
Yeah.
I didn't know they were that advanced.
Well, it's kind of like the Old Republic in the Star Wars. They had better technology than in the original trilogy somehow.
Right, yeah. That's what Tony Curtis. That's where Kirk Douglas kills Tony Curtis, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I one of the things that film goes into is the Roman politics at the time, where there was Marcus Crassus was being sent off to go put down the slave revolts, which there was controversy over that, because if you didn't win, I think, wasn't it Socrates who got blamed for an Athenian defeat? There was I think or he criticized it. I can't remember which one it was, but if you were on the wrong side politically, that could cost you your life, because the winning side would not overlook it. That's what happened. In fact, that's what happened to Cicero. Is he was critical of Caesar, and he was critical of other people. When Caesar was assassinated, Mark Antony's response was to have anyone who had opposed Caesar killed. And I think it was Cicero who was one of them as a result. So you had to play the game well. You couldn't be a slacker or not be on your toes. So that for Caesar, he had to come back victorious. So even if he hadn't been killed on the battlefield, he could have been killed or exiled or disgraced back home.
Yes, well, the great speech from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar was when Brutus called him a man of ambition. That was the prime.
Caesar was ambitious.
Yeah, Caesar was ambitious, and that was the great speech that actually what is his name did a great
Damian Lewis.
Damian Lewis. Oh, that was he is a brilliant actor. Not to get we won't get off on a tangent. TJ and I tend to do that, but if you can find it should be on YouTube. If you can find Damian Lewis's speech from Julius Caesar, I highly recommend listening to it and watching. He's a very compelling, brilliant British actor. A lot of Americans didn't know he was British.
It's crazy how many guys from Band of Brothers were actually British actors. The guys in this American Easy Company, most of the good chunk of the actors were actually British, which was funny.
I didn't know that. Yeah, that's right. He goes all the way back to that. Well, a lot of people know him from he's the star of Billions now, and he was also the star of Homeland on Showtime.
Oh, gotcha.
And he won a Emmy for Homeland, but he's a great, brilliant actor. And he doesn't age either. He's like, if you see him now, because he was in Band of Brothers, and God, that's ancient, right? And I mean, the guy's the guy's like well in his 50s, and he just looks exactly the same. But who knows? Maybe plastic surgery. I don't know. But this is going back to the cutthroat politics in Rome. Now the Gallic Wars were kind of, from what I understand of history, the average Roman citizen didn't necessarily see the point of them, and the
shock.
Yeah, and right, kind of like now, right, with it. But you were right, like the people such as Cicero and the other what do we call it, the elite class, yeah, they didn't like it so much because they feared his power. Look at if he wins, he's popular, and they also and I think they might have had some concern about his what appeared to them to be a bloodlust. It was like you said, 1 million Celts. Even by today's standards, that's a huge number.
Yeah, with Caesar, he's a very fascinating character. Where I after I read about the Celtic Holocaust, I was just amazed. But the thing is, it's not like he sat down one day and said, "I'm going to go kill 1 million Celts just because I feel like it." What happened is
that's just the kind of guy he was.
Yeah, we're going to play out this whole master plan, and that's going to solve our problem up north. What happened is they kept having these migrations. The Helvetii would come in when they were being pushed out of their original area, and this is. The thing is, as the Romans later learned, you don't let foreign peoples migrate into your territory. It's just always a huge issue. And even though the Helvetii were, in a very vulnerable position,
are you trying to say diversity is not our strength?
Well, here's another. It's funny how there's another. The next in my book, the next battle that's decisive is. Adrianople, I think is the way to describe it, but it was where the entire field army of the Eastern Roman Empire was destroyed by the Goths after this huge migration had occurred of these Germanic groups from the East, and they had been permitted to enter the Roman territory on several conditions, but then they ended up declaring war on, getting into fights. They wiped out the whole army. So Caesar was, as brutal as he was, this is something that I think really modern people need to understand. Brutality back then was often not a preference, but pragmatism and survival based.
A necessity, in other words.
A necessity. If you wanted to survive in the ancient world, you had to have a level of ruthlessness. When you have 200,000 foreign peoples migrating into your territory, and they're much bigger than your little army, you can't tolerate it because they are eventually going to, one of you is, the reality is one of you is going to get wiped out. It's either going to be you or it's going to be them. That's just the unfortunate reality of the ancient world. It's not like where you have a dispute and you can all still go to Safeway afterwards and buy food. You have a neighborly dispute or something like that. What was happening is that was occurring, and the boundaries of their empire was always under threat. So the idea is, oh, let's move up north, take care of that threat. Well, then there'd be another threat above them, and then they kept moving up more and more. It wasn't like they were conquering a centralized one big group. But what was interesting in Caesar's book is he was praising these Celtic people as being very this is the irony. He portrayed their fight as a fight for freedom. They were fighting for freedom against him. And Carlin goes into that in his podcast saying, why would Julius Caesar almost make them seem noble and idealistic and heroic in their fight against him? And he said, because he's writing this after he's won the war. So now he's got to paint these people as having some sort of similarities with the Romans, because the idea is you Romanize them. You bring them into the empire. You make them.
You made some of them senators.
You make some of them subjects, senators, citizens. Yeah. But for the Romans at the time, they're barbarians. They're savages. Right. They're outside of.
Yeah. Well, didn't Cicero write about that? He was disgusted by. And maybe it wasn't Cicero. I think it may have been.
It was Tacitus.
It was Tacitus, disgusted by they made all these what they saw as barbarians. Because I'm guessing like people like Cicero, never left, the greater Roman city area. He lived out. He had a huge estate, from what I understand, right? But he never really ventured outside of Italy. I'm thinking, you know what I mean? He was a bit of a homebody that just liked to, he was a man of letters, shall we say? Right. He wasn't a warrior.
He was actually an attorney. He was a lawyer. So
okay.
He was not, but like you were saying, John, they were, excuse me. Tacitus had written a small pamphlet about the Germanic peoples, and I think he was accurate in a sense, because he describes part of their behavior that's was probably not very appealing to the Romans. The men would get drunk when they weren't fighting wars. They would just sit around and get drunk and drink beer. But he was
what the fuck, man? And the Irish still did the same thing. We're great fighters. It's like
he was describing how the family units were incredibly strong, and if you will, the nuclear family of the Germanic tribes were very they're stable. He said that there was, from what he understood, there was virtually no infidelity that went on in within those tribes, and they were very brave. And they had, I think, one of the other things he liked was they would have called stoicism, their ability to endure hardship without complaint and just keep moving forward with life. So at the same time, Tacitus probably wouldn't have fit in at all with the Germans. But I think what he was noting is, or lamenting, is that Rome was getting big, fat, and happy and decadent. And the Germanic tribes, the Celtic tribes, had that resiliency needed to win in the long term, which is in fact what ended up happening. The Germanic tribes ended up conquering much of the Roman Empire. I did. You were mentioning that the first Generics and their council surrendered because they were afraid that their gods would die off, or they wouldn't be remembered. Dan Carlin ended his podcast on this, where he was recreating, as a child, he was recreating this battle scene, and his nanny, who was this Irish girl named Maureen, or I think that's the name of it. She was asking him who won. And of course, Dan says, well, Caesar. She goes, really? What language do they speak in Italy? Not Latin. They don't speak it in Italy. She goes, there are still people who speak Gaelic, because that's still the same language from the time period. So she was kind of making Dan was making an interesting point, as was his nanny. If that's what she actually said, was they won the war, but the language is still around. Like that because language conveys so much of a culture in a way that people, I don't think, fully appreciate. And it's changed definitely in 1,000, 2,000 years. But it's still, the core is still there. Whereas Latin is a dead language. The only people who speak it are classically trained people. Maybe they are lawyers or scientists. But
all the muscles and bones and tendons in your bodies have Latin names.
Yeah. So I thought that was a very interesting point in the sense that the fear of having your culture get wiped out and completely forgotten is, I think that and even Dan was going through this in his podcast saying, he was trying to think of what that looked like. And I was like, well, Dan, just wait a few years and look around you.
Yeah, right.
Like, that's what it's like to have your culture destroyed.
Yeah. Well, we're going to stick on this and then we'll have an epilogue, but one of the reasons when I first approached TJ with this idea, we wanted to talk about not just great battles, but great battles that if they had gone the other way, we don't know. You know what I mean? They were, like Gettysburg or these were defining battles in history like this. So in other words, if Caesar had lost this battle, it would have been the end of his campaign. Support would have fallen away. More Gaelic tribes would have flocked to Vercingetorix. He wouldn't have had the money to keep. Caesar wouldn't have had the money to keep paying the mercenaries. His men would have been demoralized. There would have been no way to continue the campaign. So that would have meant that the Roman Empire would have more or less stayed on the outer border of Italy. And who knows? Maybe they would have other tribes would have been emboldened by the victory of the Gauls and attempted to make other incursions. We don't know.
Right. I think that probably one of the most immediate. Well, here's another thing that would have been hard to predict. If Caesar was to return in defeat, would he have also not disbanded the army and just gone all in by invading and starting a civil war? Would he have done that anyways? I mean,
no. The reason I'd say he wouldn't have, because he wouldn't have had that loyalty. His army wouldn't have been that loyal.
True. That is true. That is definitely a good point. I think that Caesar probably would have become politically neutered. He would have become. Yes. He would have probably been removed from the trinity of the
triumvirate.
And what would have likely happened is the Republic would have avoided an emperor probably for a little bit longer. Another crisis would have caused that to happen. It might have extended things out a little bit longer, but I think another thing that could have occurred is Gaul. Also, Britannia. Britain could have avoided all.
Britain would never have been invaded. If that's one thing that never would have happened. If Vercingetorix had been victorious or even stalemated him, there never would have been the invasion. Because even Caesar almost called off the invasion of Britain because it was so costly. The initial incursions. The first one was repelled.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting though with that is Roman influence, based on what I've read and seen in England, is it definitely, there's like antiquity, historical curiosities, and also the Romans founded the city of London. The city of London might not exist
because the Roman baths wouldn't be there. Yeah.
Roman baths wouldn't be there. Now, their effects on the culture would have been different because really when the Romans left, I think the Britons went back to doing what they had been doing before in a lot of ways, or they just didn't preserve it, or the Saxons base could have destroyed everything during their invasions and during that time period where we have really no written word. But I think that a case could be made that London would have never been built, that it would have been
another point that a lot of people might not have taken into consideration if Caesar had not conquered Vercingetorix was Christianity would have spread, because it only spread because of Rome, because it became the religion of the empire, and that way it spread like wildfire. Well, if there was a clear delineation between Rome and not Rome, would that religion have spread the way it would have? I don't know.
Yeah, I think another thing is Boudica would have never really been known because there would have been no revolt. I mean, yeah,
That's another battle we can talk about in the future.
yeah. I saw her statue in London. I watched and read a little bit about her her fight, and it's always been it's what's interesting is she represents she's a Celt. She was a Briton. She was not Anglo-Saxon, and so England has a very interesting history in terms of its heroes because of the different people use the word white. I'm like, just go to England, go tell a Welshman that he's the same as an Englishman and see how long he
well, go tell an Irishman he's the same as an Englishman. Yeah, see if you survive before you finish the sentence. But
yeah. So I think what's there's two fascinating questions to ask is what wouldn't have changed and what would have. I wonder to what extent that would have or could have led. I mean, Vercingetorix could have. Here's another thing to contemplate. Vercingetorix, if he had won, he would have had the authority to really potentially unify all the tribes and say, we need to create this is because he would have said, look, this is what happens when you unify and you centralize. We can repel anybody. We can basically win. And so what you do is you create a country, not a nation, because there are the different tribes, but you create a actual empire that is capable of repelling future invasions.
Yeah, but see, I'm suspicious of that. I think that what would have happened, and I could be dead wrong in this, but I think what would have happened. No, you're right. The Celts did have all this commonality. They shared a common language, a common ethnicity, and a common religion. That is usually enough to hold,
people together.
But I think that there would have been. Let's assume he, at least kicked the Romans out of Gaul. Let's assume that far. The Romans just said it's not worth it. Too much in blood and treasure. We'll just go back into Italy. I think that what would have happened was during his lifetime, he would have achieved power, but I don't think he would have been able to endure because the idea of having a large centralized power structure over such a vast area was just not the Celtic way.
Yeah, I think that's another, that would have been a struggle of his. He would have, I mean, if he'd been ruthless and, this is again speculation, he would have had to have killed all the chieftains and basically say, it's me. I don't think that was ever his intent, or there's a lot of risk because then you have a lot of people who are going to be angry at you. And that's why a lot of these Germanic empires, I mean, you had the Vandals, you had the Visigoths, you had the Ostrogoths, you had all of these Germanic empires that saw initial success in terms of military, but after they won, they just kind of dissipated. They blended into existing Roman culture. There was the Gothic Wars in northern Italy that really depopulated much of the peninsula. So I think that's. It's funny how winning a war doesn't mean you win. Your heritage endures in the long term. I think that's. I mean, if you want a modern example of that, look at England. It won World War II, but look what's happening to the country right now.
Right.
You can still fall apart as a country even if you win a war. So they may have just faded out, or maybe another group of people would have come in. We do know there's several things. The Romans would have never gone to England, at least at that time period, and it's very possible that their presence was never there. Like what's the name of that wall?
Hadrian's Wall.
Yeah, Hadrian's Wall would have never been there, and I'm trying to think of other things. I mean, the political outcome of the Roman Civil War and Caesar Caesar's assassination on top of that, because Caesar was planning to introduce all. I mean, people could talk about, you know, the hypothetical of Caesar not being assassinated. He was going to introduce all these different reforms, politically, domestic reforms that could have been for the better. One would argue, or one could argue, because there were problems with the Republic that Cicero was really not acknowledging directly. That's I think Caesar recognized from a political point of view. So his death would have it just maintained those problems. So yeah, it's what's so hard is we'd have to assume what someone would do if that hadn't happened. Like so many different peoples, you know, what would Pompey have done? What would have the powers that be in the Senate, like Brutus, like what would he have done if Caesar had lost? And
yeah, well, I don't think he would have saw him as a threat. I really don't think that they would have saw Caesar as a threat if he had lost. I mean, he would have, you know, he wouldn't have come back to, you know, that big parade in Rome where, you know, they're all throwing what were they, flower petals or something at him, or, you know, I don't think that would have happened. You know, he would have just, he would have came back, you know, he would have came back with plenty of booty and slaves and stuff, but it wouldn't have been enough to, you know, ultimately he was defeated. He wouldn't have had the undying loyalty of his men if he had lost at the siege of Alesia. That's when his men literally would have died for him after that, because he apparently, at least from his description of events, he fought right alongside them. So,
right.
And he may have, we don't know. I mean, but I think that would have been the end of his political ambitions. Also, he was not a young man at that point for the ancient world, wasn't he? He was, you know, he was getting up there.
Yeah, he was already bald.
Yeah, it was already.
Well, I mean, he was already, I'd say, in his middle age. He was not a young man. He wasn't. So it's I'm just trying to think of all the different things that happened as a result of Caesar coming into power. And I mean, there was political upheaval in Egypt where Cleopatra committed suicide. Oh, sorry, that was during Octavian. But again, that wouldn't have happened. No one would know who Caesar Augustus is. Mm-hmm. Or Octavian, he was, you know, that he probably would have just gone into obscurity. He wouldn't have become anything.
Well, yeah, what would have been Mark Antony, right? Mark Antony was pretty much rode on Caesar's coattails to power, didn't he?
Well, yeah, that, and also there would have been I don't know if there'd have been any Shakespeare plays, at the very least, no Shakespeare plays about Caesar. Or
well, yeah, there certainly wouldn't be Julius Caesar.
Right. Well, there would be no. I mean, unless it ended in such a bad tragedy that the bard thought this will make a great story.
Right.
where he's like, oh, we gotta do that. I also think that maybe France and Germany would emphasize those the Celtic heritage. Maybe a little bit more in their culture. Maybe, I don't know. Like if it's kind of like with
well, one thing that would have happened, I think that we could agree on, that is, of course it's speculation, but there is facts behind it, was if the Celts had been victorious, the Germans wouldn't have been able to make incursions into Gaul.
Right.
Not easily, because they were similar, but they were distinct. They had a different language, and they were both Indo-European tribes, but there were differences. So that they kind of would have held them at the Rhine, I'm guessing. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny how these, for people who don't really don't know, much of Europe used to be completely, like, the peoples there were all Celts, for the most part. In most of mainland Europe, the Germans and the Goths, you know, the Franks, they came from east originally. They were
so did the Celts originally. We believe that they all came from the the Indo-European tribes all came out of the Caucasus, and I believe that's where we get the word Caucasian, by the way.
I think that's true. Yeah, and I think that
the Celts were just the first tribe to leave. Like, it was the Celts, the Germans, I think the Balts and the Slavs. They all came out in successive waves, separated by hundreds of thousands of years.
If you want to understand that there was an actual, I'm looking it up right now, Helvetica or something like that. But there was an actual Celtic empire of some kind, and it was loosely, or maybe it was just just where they populated, but they had a capital city. It
was probably built more around Troy.
Celtic Empire. I think that was what it was. I'm looking it up right now. Here we go. Yeah, it's
I don't think it was much of an empire, because I don't think they subjugated other people than other Celts, as far as I understand it. So I guess, I don't know if you get, I guess it depends how you define empire, but
right.
Yeah, I mean, it was a vast amount of territory, yes, but I just don't think it was in the Celtic culture to subjugate other tribes. They were a lot more insular than the Romans. They that was just kind of their thing, they were quite comfortable, at least for hundreds of years, to war amongst themselves and neighboring tribes. So I could be dead wrong. TJ, we're gonna wrap this up. We'll talk after this, and we can have notes of this. But I just want to say, because we've gone over an hour, to everybody watching, please post any questions or questions you have or comments you have in the comment section. Please like and subscribe if you find this interesting. Also, if you could put in the comments what you'd like us to discuss in our next episode, if TJ is so willing, and perhaps we'll have on other guests as well to talk about other battles, and specifically where we'd like to discuss battles that it's like, what if they had went the other way? So keep that in mind when you're making suggestions. We'd like to talk about battles that, what would have happened if, and like classic example was like Gettysburg or Antietam or something like that. So these are not to discount how there's other great battles we could talk about too, but that's kind of the focus of this little series that we're doing. So, but TJ, could you please tell people where they can find you and a little bit about what you're about, and talk about the book you just published, which is kind of not too different than what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I was about to say. So I'm a writer, author, and reporter from Washington State, and I've written numerous novels that you can find on my website, tjmartinel.com. There's one trilogy that takes place in Seattle in the future, and it's starting to sound more and more like Seattle right now. There's also an old-fashioned, like, if you like Humphrey Bogart, you're going to like the book. It's called Men Who Walk Alone. I did a chat with John about that a couple of years ago. And then the latest book that I've released is called The Song of Wolfgar. That is a story that's set initially in parts of Europe, but it takes place in the Enchantments, which is a very Tolkien-esque location near where I live, and it involves a tribe, kind of a remnant of the Helvetii tribe that leaves, during that whole kind of after Caesar's period, and it's written in the Beowulf style, so kind of old-fashioned story.
Yes, very good. I've read 2 of TJ's books, and I really enjoy his style. He's also published several short stories.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's right. So I've written a bunch of short stories for Terror House Magazine at terrorhousemag.com.
Yeah, Terror House Mag.
And they're releasing 2 of my novellas, at least one of them next year. It's going to be The Pilgrim's Digress. That's a post-dystopian tale that you can read on their website right now. The other one, we just signed the book contract. It's called The Legend of Ferenya, The Twilight Kingdom. That's kind of I'm trying to think of a way to describe it. It's a it's a fantasy story, but it's different from probably most fantasy that you've read. So.
Okay. And I have read a lot of TJ's work, not all of it, but a lot of it. And he's a great writer, and I won't have him tell your age, but he's a young man and a bright guy too. And despite his cynicism, he's a lot younger than you think he is. But he's a great guy, and actually I consider him a friend, and he's also a fellow Washingtonian. But anyway, we're going to end the broadcast here. Like I said, please like, comment, and subscribe, and comment below. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this broadcast.